This is the third episode in an alternate history series on Eastern Rome, commonly known as the Byzantine Empire. This episode will take a relatively quick look at the changes in borders around the Roman Republic, as well as some of the bigger changes within Rome's neighboring countries. I won't be focusing too much on the world outside the Balkans and the Middle East, so for this scenario, just assume that much of world history that isn't mentioned happens in a very similar way to ours. Many of the same events still happen, but maybe some happen for different reasons than in our timeline. Now, we left off with a mostly Greek-speaking Roman Republic that controls a good portion of the Balkans, as well as Anatolia, and is a major player on the world stage. First, I want to point out 3 changes I would like to make to this scenario, as I frankly find it more reasonable, and a few comments on my previous video simply had me convinced. Antioch remains part of the Roman Republic and is mostly Greek-speaking. The Bulgars are also completely assimilated into the majority Greek-Roman culture centuries before the formation of the Republic. This results in there being no Bulgaria or Bulgars, and moves the Roman border further north along the Danube, rather than following the Balkan mountains. I also want to clarify that the regions that broke away from Rome during the Civil War were not Muslim or Arab, but rather mostly Aramaic-speaking Christian regions that had been further re-Christianized during the centuries of Roman rule. Apart from those 3 things, and their resulting consequences, the scenario remains the same. Now we'll go ahead and take a look at the Middle East. The Middle East in this world is very diverse. The Arabian Peninsula and the south, along with Iran, is mostly Muslim, major groups being the Arabs and Persians, but the north and Levantine coasts is much more Christian, with the major language being Aramaic. Meanwhile, Egypt is divided between Christian Coptic Egyptians and Muslim Arabs. This creates a very blurred line between the Islamic and Christian world, since there is a lot of overlap, especially in Egypt, where many Christians and Muslims live alongside each other. Let's go into some more detail and look at the countries in the Middle East. Armenia as a nation was created after a referendum in 1914, where they decided on independence, rather than remaining under the Roman Republic, which had become an overwhelmingly Greek nation over time. Armenia is a secular republic with many minority groups, such as the Kurds, although the majority of people living there do speak Armenian and are Christian. Armenia isn't a member of NATO or the European Union, but it does have a close economic partnership with Rome and its neighbor to the north, Georgia, although relations with neighboring Azerbaijan are not great. Apart from that, Armenia has a decently sized population of around 18 million and respectable GDP of around 218 billion. To the south of Armenia, we also have Assyria, which was one of the regions that broke free from Rome during the rise of nationalism and general unrest in Rome in the decades preceding the Roman Civil War. It also acquired more land along the Levantine coast during the Civil War. Today, Assyria is a fairly diverse nation, with Aramaic-speaking Christians and Arabic-speaking Muslims living alongside each other in the southern provinces, as well as a mix of Greek, Armenian, and Aramaic speakers in the north, who are all mostly Christian. There's also a small Kurdish community in Assyria. Assyria is much like Armenia, not in NATO or the EU, but it does have close economic ties to both Rome and its southern neighbor Israel, which was supposed to be part of Assyria after their land grab during the Roman Civil War, but the British managed to take control of the region before Assyria, and it would later become Israel. Assyria is definitely one of the most notable Christian Middle Eastern nations, with a population of 34 million and GDP of just over 400 billion. Now let's get to the part of the video that could never stir up any controversy: Israel. Before you freak out at the borders I've drawn up, remember that in this world, the region that we know as Israel and Palestine is very different from our timeline. In my scenario, the world wars still happen in a similar fashion, and many Jews still migrate to the region. But unlike in our timeline, Britain didn't acquire Palestine following the Great War, but instead following the Roman Civil War, where the region was very unstable. The region is not majority Arab or Muslim before the Jewish migration there either. It is instead mostly Aramaic-speaking and Christian, having been heavily re-Christianized by Rome. The Roman Republic, along with the newly founded Assyrian nation, hesitantly agreed to the creation of a Jewish homeland in the province of Palestine, at the request of the British, and the local Aramaic-speaking Christians in Palestine either stayed as citizens of Israel or moved north to Assyria. So in what becomes Israel in this world, hardly enough Muslim Arabs live for there to be any serious movement for their own state, and thus no controversial conflict like in our own timeline ever happens there. The only controversy regarding the region is a small irredentist movement in Assyria, which isn't taken too seriously. Today Israel, just like all the former Roman Middle Eastern countries, has close ties to its mostly Christian Middle Eastern neighbors. It also relies heavily on Rome and the United States for military protection from powerful neighbors such as Arabia. Israel has a population of just under 9 million and a GDP of around 370 billion, making it very wealthy per capita for a Middle Eastern nation. The Kingdom of Arabia, despite never having been a part of Rome, is still very worth mentioning. It formed as a consequence of Britain colonizing the region and establishing a protectorate in Arabia. Around the same time, they did the same with Egypt. The royal family which Britain put in charge of administering the protectorate stayed in power after the British started decolonizing following World War II. Today, Arabia is a major regional power with a population of 130 million and GDP of 1.8 trillion, making it very rich and one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It is a fairly authoritarian regime, but still very liberal compared to our timeline Saudi Arabia, perhaps more comparable to our world's Iran, if it was bigger and wealthier. It also has a fairly turbulent relationship with the West, and a very complicated relationship with Iran, as both want to be the Islamic power in the world. But at the same time, cooperation with Iran is convenient, as they both have Western-aligned neighbors right on their doorstep. To the west of Arabia is another nation that was under Britain before it was decolonized, the Republic of Egypt. By the time of the Roman reconquest of Egypt in the early 1500s, Egypt had become majority Muslim and Arabic speaking, but there was still a sizable Coptic Egyptian speaking Christian minority. During the approximately 300 years Egypt was under Rome, following its reconquest, the empire did, like much of its Middle Eastern lands, heavily attempt to Christianize it by putting local Christian leaders in charge, supporting Christian churches, and taxing Muslims harsher than Christians. This process was fairly successful, but due to Egypt's much larger population than the Levant, it wasn't as effective there. By the time Rome lost Egypt during the rise of nationalism, Coptic Egyptians had gone from somewhere between 10 and 20% of the population to a very slim majority. The Christian community continued to slowly grow during their years under the British Empire, and today it is a fairly religiously and linguistically divided nation. Egypt today has close ties to its other former Roman neighbors, as well as the Roman Republic itself. It even has small Greek communities in the north of the country. It's also one of the bigger players in Middle Eastern politics, and along with Rome, it forms the mostly Western-aligned bloc in the region, which is often at odds with Iran and Arabia. Egypt has a population of just under 100 million and a GDP of a little over $1 trillion, making it one of the larger economies in the Middle East and the world. But because of its large population, it isn't particularly wealthy per capita, more comparable to poorer countries in Europe like Croatia. That was the Middle East. Now we'll go ahead and take a look at the Balkans. The borders in the Balkans in this world were decided in large part by politics and the influence of foreign powers, but were also somewhat based on local demographics. Wallachia and Moldavia, for instance, remain separate countries despite sharing a language as a result of the Romans and Russians competing for influence in the region, with Russia occasionally controlling Moldavia directly and later on keeping it in their sphere of influence. Meanwhile, Rome insisted on keeping Wallachia independent to avoid Russian influence and to keep it in the Roman sphere. Hungary also got to keep Transylvania despite it having a large population that shares language and culture with Wallachia and Moldavia, as the Western powers wanted a stronger buffer state to avoid Rome or the Soviets expanding their influence into the newly carved up Austria-Hungary after World War I. When taking a look at the Western Balkans, it's once again political decisions by outside powers that decided their fate. During the carving up of Austria-Hungary, there was a lot of discussion regarding a united South Slavic nation, but Rome insisted on keeping the Kingdom of Serbia around as it was a small country easy to keep under its influence. A united South Slavic nation could pose a threat if it were to ally with the Russians. Thus, as a compromise, the Kingdom of Serbia would be given much of what was once Bosnia, and the remaining former Austro-Hungarian Balkans would become the Republic of Croatia. The borders were partially drawn along ethnic Serb-Croat lines, but there were still communities of Serbs in Croatia and vice versa. So Serbia and Croatia had a population exchange in an attempt to avoid future conflict, although there was still the Slovene minority in northern Croatia, which has remained a controversial issue till this day. And that's all for now. Hope this quick look at the Roman Republic's neighbors was interesting and satisfactory. If there's anything about my scenario you wish to discuss, or want me to elaborate on, feel free to leave a comment. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button if you want to see more content like this in the future. See you around.